In the great annals of history, the nuclear bomb stands out as arguably the most captivating and dreadful weapon ever made. Yet the numerous discussions it has sparked since its inception always gravitate towards either the brilliant scientists who built it or the broody politicians who decided when to use it. Oft forgotten are the pilots who had to perform the daring deed of flying into enemy territory to deliver it. So what was it like to be a nuclear bomb pilot? Well, it was a career with a long build-up, and one that many speculated would be impossible. That's what our dear friend Albert Einstein thought when he wrote to President Roosevelt on August 2nd, 1939, a mere month before Hitler's invasion of Poland. He warned that nuclear fission could be harnessed to make bombs of unprecedented power, but he imagined they'd be too big to be dropped by air and would instead have to be delivered by boat. Now, these concerns were eventually alleviated as research in the nuclear field progressed, and by the time our famous acquaintance and longtime SideQuest patron, Robert Oppenheimer, was setting up shop in New Mexico, the aerial design was all but confirmed. Of course, the bomb would still end up being pretty heavy, near the upper end of what bombers at the time could lift. But in a stroke of luck, or foresight, the US had already started developing a long-range strategic bomber that could carry it back in 1938. The B-29 Superfortress, one of the first pressurized aircraft ever built. Unfortunately, its development had been plagued by various accidents and technical issues, with the program's chief perishing in a prototype crash in February 1943. Oh dear. The choice was made for intense iteration and experimentation, for which numerous pilots were recalled from Europe to pilot various prototypes with questionable safety standards. It proved a costly decision. During 1943, over 100 prototypes would be built, of which only 15 ended up being airworthy, and the B-29 program as a whole eventually ended up costing more than the entire Manhattan Project. Nevertheless, the expense was worth it, for the project turned into a success, and in September 1943, the B-29 was confirmed as the plane that would carry the nuclear bomb. The next order of business was selecting a pilot. Unsurprisingly, the airmen who had already flown the prototypes were a natural first choice. By far, the most accomplished among them was Paul Tibbets. He had flown America's first heavy bomber mission against the Nazis on 17th of August 1942, and was among the first pilots recalled from Europe to work on the B-29 program. Tibbets was chosen to be the commander of the newly formed 509th Composite Group, and was thus informed of the ultra-secret Manhattan Project, while the crewmen working under him, all impeccable airmen in their own rights, were left blissfully unaware of their true mission. When training initially began in September 1944 on a remote airbase in Utah, many crew members thought they were being pranked. The B-29s they were supposed to fly were heavily customized, with almost all armor and weaponry stripped out, which made them virtually defenseless. And instead of flying group missions, which could sometimes include hundreds of B-29s for normal bombing raids, they would fly almost entirely solo. To top it off, they would only carry a single, awkwardly shaped bomb they'd derisively called a pumpkin. The group spent the entirety of 1944 practicing these bewildering missions, with the crew growing increasingly frustrated that they couldn't participate in the massive campaigns going on in Europe and the Pacific. One particularly lyrical crew member, alas we don't know who, wrote a satirical poem about the whole ordeal. Yet despite these grumblings, training continued apace, and in January 1945 the crew was sent to Cuba, where they could practice under more mission-appropriate conditions. And speaking of practicing under ideal conditions, we would be remiss to forget mentioning our dear friends over at War Thunder, the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. In War Thunder, you can play more than 2,000 planes, helicopters, tanks, and ships spanning over 100 years of technological development from the 1920s up to today. Each vehicle in War Thunder is modeled to incredible detail, down to its individual components, offering an unparalleled immersive experience without arbitrary hit points or abstractions. You can compete in dynamic combined arms battles against other players for free on all major platforms, including PC, Xbox, and PlayStation. And here's the best part. As a special courtesy to SideQuest viewers, you can get a 7-day premium account, multiple premium vehicles, and the Eagle of Valor decoration if you follow the link in the description. Go to playwt.link/SideQuest to play War Thunder and dominate the battlefield. But anyway, as Christopher Nolan so eloquently reminded us, the Manhattan Project successfully tested the first nuclear bomb on the 16th of July, 1945. At the same time, Tibbets and the 509th were relocating to their final operating base on the island of Tinian in the Mariana Archipelago. The group started running test missions over Japan on the 20th of July, performing 12 practice strikes in total with TNT-filled pumpkins. It took until the end of the month for all components of the first bomb, Little Boy, to arrive and be assembled in Tinian. Then, on the 6th of August 1945, at 2:45 a.m. local time, the mission commenced. Tibbets's customized B-29, which he affectionately named the Enola Gay after his mother, was the first to take off. In the following minutes, 3 more B-29s would depart, one carrying blast-measuring instruments, another carrying various photographic devices, and a spare bomber in case Tibbets ran into technical difficulties. 3 final bombers followed for weather reconnaissance over the primary target, Hiroshima, and the secondary targets of Kokura and Nagasaki. The first leg of their trip was to the island of Iwo Jima, about halfway between Tinian and Japan, where the spare bomber landed on standby. The remaining 6 bombers pressed on, reaching mainland Japan around 9 a.m. at an altitude of around 30,000 feet. The Japanese had spotted the B-29s and raised the alarm in Hiroshima, but they had also detected another 605 planes on regular bombing runs, so they made no effort to stop the small nuclear raiding party, not that they really could have anyway. By that point in the war, Japan was desperately short on planes, pilots, and fuel, and the pressurized B-29s flew high enough in the air that they were effectively out of range of most Japanese flak cannons. The reconnaissance plane reported clear weather with minimal clouds, and the go-ahead was given. Tibbets reached the center of Hiroshima at 9:15 a.m., traveling at just under 330 miles per hour. And with the flick of a switch, the little boy was let loose. The bomb was rigged to explode at an altitude of around 2,000 feet, which gave Tibbets approximately 50 seconds to get as far away from it as possible. He executed a radical 150-degree turn, stressing the B-29 to its limits, and aimed the nose of the plane down to get extra speed. When the bomb detonated, Tibbets and his crew were roughly 15 miles away, safe from any potential radiation effects, though not from the shock waves that violently shook the plane multiple times by reflecting off the ground. The photographic plane, aptly named Necessary Evil, produced several haunting images, forever capturing the dreadful power mankind unleashed that day. The bombers' return flight was uneventful, and they landed on Tinian at 3 p.m. to an impromptu medal award ceremony. Just 3 days later, a similar mission would bring destruction to Nagasaki as well. Yet the idea of nuclear bombers arriving safely back home unscathed would quickly turn into fantasy. As the Cold War took hold and the Soviet Union caught up to America's nuclear capabilities, it became clear that dropping nuclear bombs by plane against an opponent that wasn't as beaten down as Japan was in 1945 would most likely be a suicide mission. Initially, the US and allied nuclear states like France and Britain tried building faster and higher altitude bombers, but Soviet surface-to-air missiles quickly discredited that idea when they brought down Gary Powers in his U-2 stealth plane. Then, the strategy shifted in the opposite direction. Bombers would fly very close to the ground below Soviet radar coverage. A nuclear bomb pilot during the Cold War would be expected to fly low into Soviet territory, under the somewhat dubious assumption that enemy interceptor aircraft would have either been neutralized or wouldn't react fast enough. If the bomber somehow managed to strike its intended target, it would try to escape to friendly or neutral territory, with an in-air refuel supposedly waiting for them on the way back home. But the Cold War pilots were under no illusion. What was much more likely was for the majority of them to be shot down. But that's why there were enough of them to bomb the USSR back to the Stone Age, even assuming overwhelming interceptions. And even the few lucky pilots that would make it out of Russia would most likely discover that they'd have nowhere to return to. After all, the Soviets had similar plans of their own for obliterating everything on Earth twice over. So, my friends, yes, being a nuclear bomber pilot would have been a risky job at the start and a suicidal one at the end. But luckily, nuclear war hasn't happened yet, as of 2023 at least. So hopefully, we'll never know. In any case, I hope you enjoyed our brief nuclear journey. Make sure to try War Thunder using the link in the description to get all the juicy sign-up bonuses. They're a real banger. And stay tuned for the next radically explosive episode of SideQuest.